Hello and welcome to La Excellence's new series called Book Review. What we are going to do in this series is to introduce you to books, sometimes just chapters, sometimes maybe an individual essay from a book that will be useful to you in understanding the social, the political, the economic formations and processes in India, and therefore help you very much in your answers, both in the general studies answers and in the optional answers, and of course a combination of both in the general essay answers. So today I'm going to open this series by talking about one of the most important books that came out of, in some sense, Indian feminism, and that is the book Recasting Women, edited by Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Vaid, two feminist scholars who at that time were teaching at Indraprastha College for Women in Delhi University. This is a book that was published in 1989, and in many ways it's the foundational book, it's a reference book, it's still in print and it's extremely popular across universities and across other kinds of academic spaces where there is serious thought about gender as an analytic category. So this book, Recasting Women, Essays in Colonial History, came out of a conference and came out of bringing together all the interesting voices that had come and that were part of, in many ways, the feminist movement that had come together and were part of the feminist movement, a very thriving autonomous movement in the 1970s and 80s in India. And this is in many ways the first really thoughtful academic bringing together of the insights of this movement with a certain kind of academic rigor, and at the same time a kind of exploratory and very exciting methodology and a very exciting interdisciplinary perspective. So what I'm going to do today is to just talk about the introduction to this book. It's a brilliant introduction and very useful for you to understand as UPSC students how to actually think about the category gender. In many ways, what this introduction does brilliantly is to think about gender and how we are going to use gender as a category. So the book opens, the introduction opens with this understanding or with this idea that one has to understand historical processes and understand patriarchy. We use this word patriarchy all the time, by which we mean a male-dominated society. And what these feminists were doing, both were in some sense materialist feminists, that is influenced by a certain kind of Marxism, is that they were trying to argue that patriarchy has to be historicized in some sense, and that patriarchy keeps reproducing itself in different forms, in different historical moments, reconstituting itself, to quote their word for it. And so therefore one has to understand how women were reconstituted in patriarchy across the 300 years of colonialism in India. And they moved into the independent era as well. So that was their first point, that it was about understanding historical processes which reconstitute patriarchy. That's the first line of the book in many ways. The second line of the book that it takes, the line, by line I don't mean sentence, I mean the line it takes, is that it looks more at civil society. So we think in terms of civil society and the state. And in this volume they were paying more attention to civil society, partly because they thought that the focus on the state was too strong, but also, and I think very insightfully, and they didn't really develop this fully, but the point is that civil society is where a lot of the gendered ideas that we live with are formed. And so they wanted to understand civil society, to understand why gender is formed in a certain kind of way. Then the next important line that they take was to question the idea of reform. So we understand reform as there were 19th century reform movements linked to women's education with Savitribai Phule or with Pandita Ramabai, both in Maharashtra, or Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal. And we think of these as progressive movements, as movements for the advancement of women. And they were, except that these editors and these historians and critics are also questioning the limits of that reform paradigm. saying that the reform paradigm nevertheless constructed women in a certain kind of way with very limited possibilities, but also really focused on only one class of women. And that is two of their critiques of the social reform movement. They also question nationalism, which is this next sort of line in which women were framed in a certain kind of way in the nationalist movement, and argued that there too it was one class and one caste of women, but also that women were constructed in quite problematic ways. And the third broad area in which we could understand gender in colonial and post-colonial India was the question of development. And their argument is also that development itself is also a term that framed women in certain limiting ways. And they wanted to map these limited ways and see what were the ways in which we could rethink the category gender, the category women. Then what is truly remarkable about this introduction, and I want to read this section to you from the introduction, is how they understand gender. So how we understand gender, once we think gender, we only think women, and we only think, okay, so now we have to add women to whatever analysis we are doing. We're doing analysis of, say, caste, we're doing analysis of class, and we add women. You must also think about gender, and you bring gender in. And they were saying that this additive approach is wrong, that seeing gender as some special category is wrong. And they have a wonderful definition of what they understand by feminist historiography. Historiography is history writing. So this is this definition. Listen to it very closely, and it's very useful for you to understand and also apply this in all your answers across the UPSC. So this is what they say about what a feminist historiography means. A feminist historiography rethinks historiography as a whole and discards the idea of women as something to be framed by a context, like women and this, women and that. No. In order to be able to think of gender difference as both structuring and structured by the wide set of social relations. In this sense, feminist historiography is a choice open to all historians, not as a choice among competing perspectives, or even as among personal predilections of the sort which dictate interest in a particular region, so gender in Telangana or gender in Andhra Pradesh, no, or a particular historical period, gender in the 19th century, gender in the 18th century, no. Nor is the issue here the tokenist inclusion of women, known as add women and shake, yes, or the numerical or even qualitative evaluation of their participation in this or that movement. Rather, and this is important, pay very close attention to it, rather as a choice which cannot but undergird any attempt at a historical reconstruction which undertakes to demonstrate our sociality in the full sense and is ready to engage with its own presuppositions of an objective, gender-neutral method of inquiry, as well as with the presuppositions of the social moments and movements it sets out to represent. This definition is very, very useful, I think, because it does away with a lot of the ideas that we live with. That we think, for example, that methodology is gender neutral, or that in many ways you can have an objective account of a society or a movement or a moment. And they're saying no. And they're saying that gender is necessarily part of everything that you look at. You look at the economy, there's a gendered quality to that economy. You look at polity, there's a gendered quality. Anything you look at has a gendered aspect to it. And that is really what is very useful about this introduction and about this definition, really, which I want you to pay very close attention to in how you understand gender as a category in your UPSC answers. Then, as I said, the introduction goes on to talk about, and you should read this introduction very carefully, it goes on to talk about class and patriarchy, caste and patriarchy, reform movements and patriarchy, the idea of public and private being divided, and what does this division mean? How does it actually construct women in both the private and the public? The binary of tradition and modernity, and how even that binary, apart from being quite useless to understand Indian society, both tradition and modernity, they argue, construct women in limiting ways, and we need to question that. Social movements, and how we have to understand social movements as also being gendered, and even a progressive social movement can be actually quite sexist, quite disadvantageous to women. And so what they end, so they have accounts of all of these. It's a bunch of essays by different scholars, and what we'll be doing in subsequent videos with breaks, we'll go to other books, come back to this one, is actually look at each and every one of these essays in this book, because they're all brilliant essays and they're all immensely useful in a range of answers across the UPSC that you will be using or finding them relevant. So we will look at all the essays. But what I wanted to talk today, as I said, is just about the introduction. And I wanted to end with how they end this introduction, which is also important to look at and to think about. So they end the introduction by talking about how they understand gender and the idea of gender difference. And they say theoretical positions which locate patriarchy as the primary contradiction in society pose the following problem. To put it crudely, patriarchy becomes an ahistorical category within an originating myth of male coercion. That is, we understand patriarchy only as something that transcends all history and is determined only by men, whereas actually the complications of gender are much more varied, much more difficult. There is no one overarching, totalizing, male-dominated understanding of the world, and there is no one fixed understanding of patriarchy. The strength of this position is that it foregrounds patriarchal oppression as existing within all historically known modes of production and as a socio-cultural system cutting across class divisions. But its weakness lies in treating women as a class by themselves, leading to a disregard of the fact that women of the exploited classes may indeed have closer group interests with men of their own classes rather than women belonging to dominant classes. This is how they complicate the idea of any simple notion of patriarchy. And then they end the last section. So the whole introduction is really full of these insights that are very useful to you, and it's just a 20-odd page introduction that all of you should read. And they end by saying, gender difference, and the point I made earlier, gender difference is seldom seen as a structuring principle in economic processes. Again, in concentrating like the reformers on issues of family, education, and economic participation, feminist research often implicitly accepts and locates itself within the division of public and private spheres constructed in the colonial period and neglects the materiality of the wider economic and legal processes by which these spheres came into being. And so what they're going to look at is all these spheres. They end by saying, patriarchies are, after all, still being reconstituted, and not all the modalities of this process have altered. So they ask for a kind of active, dynamic approach to thinking about gender, and thinking about gender as an analytical category, as a variable, and therefore this introduction is a very useful introduction for your answers across the three domains of general studies, general essay, and your optional. Thank you.